On this edition of The Correspondents, as U.S. President Donald Trump heads to the Middle East, he leaves behind political turmoil in Washington. Meanwhile, U.S. troop involvement in Afghanistan may be on the rise as violence continues in the embattled country. And the UN Security Council holds a closed-door meeting on Venezuela, where anti-government street protests have rocked the country for weeks and scores of demonstrators have been killed. Hello, everyone. I'm Carolyn Presutti for Mil Arcega, and this is The Correspondents on Voice of America. President Donald Trump set off on his first international trip this week to the Middle East and Europe. He may be hoping to leave behind a political firestorm ignited by his firing of FBI Director James Comey. Reports he pressed Comey to end the investigation of his former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and his reported sharing of classified intelligence with Russia. VOA national correspondent Jim Malone has more.
We're going to meetings right now.
Another chaotic day at the White House as reporters grill President Trump over his decision to share classified intelligence with Russian officials.
Good morning, everybody.
Each day seems to bring a new crisis, including reports that Trump pressed the former FBI Director James Comey to drop his probe of fired National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and the shifting White House explanations for the recent firing of Comey. While dispensing advice to Coast Guard cadets at their commencement in Connecticut Wednesday, the president fired back at his critics and the news media.
No politician in history, and I say this with great surety, has been treated worse or more unfairly. You can't let them get you down. You can't let the critics and the naysayers get in the way of your dreams.
With the White House in turmoil, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer wonders whether the president can be believed.
There's a crisis of credibility in this administration, which will hurt us in ways almost too numerous to elaborate. At the top of the list are an erosion of trust in the presidency and trust in America by our friends and allies.
And joining me now to break all this down via Skype from the White House, Bill Gallo of VOA News, and in our D.C. studio, VOA National Security Correspondent Jeff Selden. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. So there's plenty to talk about. So first to you, Bill, at the White House. Is the president having what Schumer called a crisis of credibility? And, if so, how's he get out of it?
Well, it's really unclear at this point. I mean, scandals and crises are nothing new for the Trump presidency or the Trump presidential campaign. But what was new this past week, was that these scandals seem to be now taking a path that is a little bit outside of the control of Trump. He's long deflected. He's long tried to distract, create other big news stories to distract from whenever things have gone wrong for him. But it now appears after, the events of the last week, he may not be able to control the narrative so easily. You have the existence of these Comey memos that were reported by several news outlets. You now have a special counsel that's looking in to Russian influence in the election, as well as any possible collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. These are things now that will happen outside of Trump's control. You sense maybe even that he realizes that a little bit. He really him and his staff made less of an attempt to really even go out there and defend these actions this week in the media. We'll see what happens now as he leaves on his foreign trip, though.
Well, that's a good point. He is leaving on this foreign trip then, Bill. Will that take this off the minds of the American people? That's a distraction in itself, right? He's going to Israel, he's going to Rome, he's going to Saudi Arabia. Won't that be off the news cycle then?
Well, the White House certainly hopes that it will. And in fact, in Trump's press conference yesterday, he repeatedly said, look, this is a witch hunt, but this is something that now, it will take its course, and I'm going to focus on what I want to do for this country. He really wants to get back to what his agenda is. Will that happen? As I mentioned, some things are out of his control now, so we don't know what the next development will be. But also on this foreign trip, it's important to know he's going to Saudi Arabia, where he'll give a speech on Islam. That's not something that is, without risk. I mean, this is a presidential candidate who during his campaign, called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims into the United States. He later went back on that, changed that proposal. But, you know, this is not risk-free by any means. He's also going to the Vatican. He clashed with the Pope during the presidential campaign. The relationship there seems better now, but there's no guarantee this will go smoothly.
So, Bill, you mentioned something about a special counsel. The special counsel has been appointed, former FBI Director Robert Mueller, and that's to look into the connection, if there's any connection, between Russia and the election with the Trump campaign. Jeff, let me turn to you now. How does this special counsel work? How does it exactly go into play in this investigation?
Well, we have to understand there are some unique circumstances here. Already from the get-go, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, recused himself from any of the Russia investigations because of his meetings with the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Kislyak. So then you have the Deputy Attorney General, Rosenstein, who comes on and is under immense pressure and is involved in the mini scandal about writing the memo that helps Trump justify firing the FBI Director, James Comey, when he did. So earlier this week, the Deputy AG comes out and appoints us a special counsel. And what he says in his statement is that based upon the unique circumstances, the public interest requires me, and this again, what his quote, to place this investigation under the authority of a person who exercises a degree of independence outside the normal chain of command. So basically, by appointing this special counsel, you have somebody coming in who's very well versed. You have a former FBI director, a well-known, reputable lawyer, Robert Mueller, who can come in, take a look at this. He's going to be able to take the FBI agents who are already working on the investigation, and he's going to be able to delve into some of this without the aura of political interference, without the scandals, if you will, that with the reports that Trump asked Comey to lay off in the investigation or see his way clear of ending this investigation against his former National Security Advisor, General Flynn. So this will give a degree of independence to the investigation. It gives a renewed degree of credibility, I think, is what they're hoping from the investigation. It takes it out of all the political turmoil.
Someone unbiased, someone who is external.
Yeah,
and it gives him freedom, too, right, to investigate broader areas.
Right. If you look at the order that came with the appointment of the special counsel, he's allowed to look at any links or coordination between the Russian government and individuals, including those associated with the Trump campaign. And it also says he's going to be charged with looking at, quote, any matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation, which gives him a pretty wide scope. If you look at previous special counsels, like the situation with Watergate, the investigation into the break-in at Watergate and the investigation of then President Nixon, the charges that ultimately led Nixon to resign weren't the initial charges. So in this case, the former FBI director, Robert Mueller, has the ability to look at things, and if he finds different threads, if he finds things that look suspicious, he's going to be able to pursue those leads. In the investigation, the hope is we'll just see justice done, whether there's something there or whether there's not something there.
Good point. And also, people are worried that this will extend it, though. This will make the investigation extend out months, hopefully not years, but that remains to be seen. Let's go back on that memo that you referred to just a bit, the fact that Comey is saying that he took notes after he met with President Trump, and President Trump said something about letting it go, talking about his national security advisor. It alludes to the fact that maybe he didn't want him to investigate, but Comey is expected to be in a public hearing this coming week where he'll be asked those questions, and also already President Trump has said no, he wasn't asking that. So we might have a he said kind of investigation going on here. Any comment on that? Bill, what do you say? I mean, if it is just he said this and he disagrees with it, will we ever have a closure to this matter?
It's not clear, and we don't really know even what Comey will say. But the existence of these memos is possibly something that is extremely relevant here. We don't know what the memos say. There's only been a couple of news reports on them. He is said to have taken very thorough notes and was said to be very concerned about some of the things that Trump actually was pressuring him to do. Of course, Trump denies that. There will be an element of he said, as you mentioned, but we don't really know how that's going to play out, I guess.
And the one thing you have to prove with obstruction of justice is also intent, which will be very difficult to prove in this case, being that it was verbal and it was in a meeting. Very quickly, Jeff, with all these controversies, is Russia laughing at us?
Well, there's a high degree of suspicion among former intelligence officials, some current intelligence officials, that Russia is getting exactly what it wanted. Now, when you look at the unclassified report that was put out by the intelligence community about what Russia wanted, their interference in the presidential election, it was that ultimately they wanted Trump to win. But what does Russia want most of all? It wants its enemies in chaos. It wants them having difficulties so it can move ahead with its agenda, whatever it may be. So there are some who think that Russia has exactly what it wants and that Putin is laughing all the way to the bank.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Bill. Fascinating discussion. We are taking a short break now, but when we come back, the possibility that President Trump may soon be ratcheting up U.S. troop involvement in Afghanistan. Stay tuned. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
News and notes. This is Living Better.
Tora Johansson is 75 now, but 50 years ago he lost his right hand in a car accident. He's felt phantom pain in the missing hand ever since. Now, a new augmented reality treatment is helping. With sensors attached to his right elbow, Tora can move a virtual hand, says Chalmers University of Technology professor Max Catalan.
They feel they can control the pain better because they have a better control over their phantom limb.
The idea is to reactivate areas of the brain used before the limb was amputated. Johansson says it works.
My wife said pain I had before took so much from me. She said I should live about 10 years more after this.
In a first clinical trial, 14 amputees reported a 50% decrease in their phantom pain following 6 weeks of treatment. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
VOA, telling America's story for more than 70 years.
The voice speaking from America and the war.
VOA exports America's most powerful product, freedom of speech.
Close the waters.
In parts of the world, information is scarce and oppression real. VOA, sharing a voice that says, we report the truth.
And welcome back to The Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Carolyn Persutti in Washington. 3 months ago, the top commander of U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan said he needed a few thousand more troops to break a stalemate in the 15-year-long war against the Taliban. Now, officials say the Trump administration could provide him with that manpower. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb explains.
With the arrival of warmer weather, the fighting season is heating up in Afghanistan. But the Trump administration has yet to announce its policy plans for the war-torn country.
No decision has been made, so let's not get ahead of what that ultimate policy will be.
But military officials tell VOA that policy could include sending a few thousand more international troops to Afghanistan. Leaders have previously tried surging international troop numbers to battle the Taliban, but experts say this tactical increase would serve a different strategy.
This time we are directly enabling the Afghan army, so we're trying to make that army more powerful, and so it's a different thrust than what we did in the past.
Officials say the administration's developing policy would focus less on international troop numbers needed and more on the capabilities needed, providing the resources for increased Afghan air power and special forces.
And joining me now for more is via Skype in Islamabad, VOA South Asia correspondent Ayaz Gul. Hi, Ayaz. And also from the Pentagon, we have Carla Babb. Carla will be joining us by phone. So let's look at the facts, guys. We have 8,400 troops in Afghanistan now. Carla, how many more are really needed? I know you mentioned several thousand. I've heard upwards of 50,000 needed in order to stabilize the area.
Well, that's the funny part about asking how many we're talking about. We don't know until President Trump reveals his plan exactly how many are going to be asked for when the president goes to NATO, be them U.S. troops or be they troops from the international community. I have heard somebody told me 3,000 to 5,000 U.S. troops. Another person told me maybe 3,000 to 5,000 U.S. and international troops combined. This is something that I think President Trump has been keeping secret because they are working with their NATO allies to get that number, trying to focus more on the capabilities helping to build the Afghan Air Force, helping to build the Afghan Special Forces, rather than just counting the numbers of international troops there. And General Joe Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had said earlier that the number will actually depend on the number of forces coming from NATO first. So I think they're trying to figure out that number, and then they'll come back to the United States, and President Trump will help decide how many U.S. troops are going to be there as well.
So, Ayaz, analysts have said that we need those numbers not necessarily to conquer the Taliban, but to bring them to the negotiating table. So could this actually tip the scale in favor of the Afghan government?
Well, I think that's what the leadership in Afghanistan has been hoping for, that it will buy them some time to really conclude the reforms in the security sector so that Afghan security forces are able to go on the offensive in this fighting season or maybe next year in order to put more pressure on the Taliban, to send a clear message to the insurgents that, let's talk, let's have peace talks, because you won't be able to win on the battlefield. But again, there is a lot of skepticism about whether it's 3,000, 5,000 or 50,000 troops, because we know that there used to be more than 140,000 troops in Afghanistan, and at that time the Taliban was not in control of even few districts. And today they are in control or influencing nearly 40% of the country's territory. So it is still, I think, more of a strategy to buy time, to enable the Afghan government to be in a position where it can improve governance and it can improve its diplomatic efforts to bring the Taliban, with the help of regional countries, particularly Pakistan, to the negotiating table to find an end to this protracted conflict in Afghanistan.
It's interesting that you bring this back to several years ago when we had so many more troops in the country. I've also heard that there will be no negotiating on the part of the Taliban. The Taliban says that it will just embolden them because they can consider negotiation surrender, and they say it's un-Islamic to negotiate. Is that what you're hearing on the ground?
Yeah, that's what this week they issued a statement, the Taliban, and categorically refused to have any negotiations with this current government. And I think they have been emboldened by the kind of support, alleged support they've been receiving from Pakistan and lately, from Iran and Russia. So it seems that it will depend on regional players who are behind or who are supporting the Taliban to really convince them and persuade them to come to the table, because if it comes to the Taliban, they have now clearly taken this public position that any negotiations with the Kabul government would be un-Islamic.
So, Carla, what do you think? Will those regional players step up to the plate? And also, when the president meets with NATO next week, what will he tell them? And will NATO respond in kind with some more troops to go in, international forces?
I think that NATO is definitely in this for the long haul. I was with then Secretary of Defense Ash Carter last year at a NATO summit, and NATO committed to being in Afghanistan at least through 2020. There are so many things that are still needing development in the Afghan forces. The Afghan Air Force that I was mentioning earlier, that won't even be up and running until at least 2020, because you have to start from scratch. You can't just make a pilot overnight. You can't just build a plane and get planes overnight. It's a very difficult process. But I think that the worry for U.S. forces and the worry for NATO forces, there are about 13,300 combined international forces there, is if there are more, will that make the U.S. and international forces more vulnerable, and will there be more casualties? And I think that we probably will see more of that, because the United States, at least for their part, wants to go down further. Now they are supporting the corps level. They want to go down to the battalion level to help advise and assist, because they say they're too far back to really be able to be effective with their advising mission. So that is the big worry here. That's what we have to look for in the future. Is NATO, is the U.S. willing to do that? And I think that they will be.
And we'll certainly be keeping an eye on that, especially with that meeting happening next week. Thank you so much for Ayaz and Carla. Thanks for joining us. We are taking another break now, but when we come back, the violence and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and how the United Nations is taking notice. And a reminder for you, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
This is BizBeat.
Consumer demand for abalone, also called abalone, has skyrocketed since the 1990s, but the popular hard-shell sea snail, once considered a delicacy so many love to eat, has triggered a growth in illegal fishing. But at the same time, demand has ignited a growth in aquaculture companies, where South Africa leads the way. Peter Britz has studied abalone for 30 years and says most of the sea creatures supplied by farms in South Africa is beating the competition.
And it fetches about double the price of the farmed abalone from Asia.
South Africans farm abalone on land. 10 million liters of seawater are pumped in every hour at this site, and where marketing manager Werner Pike has doubled production every 6 years.
It compares to the best abalone in the world, which is the Japanese abalone.
The global abalone industry has gone from $142 million in 1991 to over $2 billion today. For VOA's BizBeat, I'm Philip Alexio.
Welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Carolyn Persutti, in for Mil Arcega in Washington. The UN Security Council held a closed-door meeting this week to discuss the deteriorating situation in Venezuela, where anti-government protests have rocked the country for more than 6 weeks, amid a worsening economic and humanitarian situation. The United States called for the Wednesday meeting, which marks the first time the 15-nation council has taken up the matter. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley saying that the United States urges the UN to respect the Venezuelan people and their need for fair and free elections. Venezuela has been shaken for weeks by near-daily anti-government street demonstrations to remove President Nicolas Maduro from power. And at least 43 people have been killed in the unrest. Joining me now with more is remotely from our UN studio, VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir, and via Skype from Caracas, VOA Spanish language service reporter Alvaro Algara. Alvaro, let's start with you. Tell us, you're there. What's it like on the ground there today?
Hello, Caroline, to you and to all the audience of Voice of America in the United States. In Venezuela, it's been 45 critical days for democracy. There is a humanitarian crisis. There is no food for the families. There is people dying, protesting against the government. The opposition wants elections. The opposition wants respect for the legislative power. They want the freedom for the nominated people in jail who talk against the government. The situation is very, very difficult. I'm completely agree with the U.S. ambassador about her position. Today was supposed to be a big meeting with the opposition leader Enrique Capriles in the United Nations, and he couldn't get out of the Venezuela to talk with the High Commissioner. His passport took, the government took his passport and they robbed it. It's a very difficult situation.
So Alvaro, let me ask you, what has to happen to break the stalemate that we're seeing there? I mean, we've had protests before in Venezuela, 2014. We also had the protest that led to that failed coup in 2002. What's different this time, and what are you hoping to see? What needs to happen?
Caroline, the opposition wants the legislative, the parliament last year. The majority of Venezuelans are in the opposition. The government, by the president Nicolas Maduro, he don't want to make elections. The opposition last year tried to make a dialogue, but they didn't complete those points. There is no elections. And so the opposition needs to. They want to keep protesting in the streets. No matter what, they want elections. It's the only solution for Venezuela. That's my position, Caroline.
Thank you, Alvaro. So, Margaret, it sounds like it's not going to happen on the ground there. It's going to happen in the UN. You had the Security Council meeting. What's up there?
Well, first, I just want to follow up on what Alvaro told you about Enrique Capriles, the opposition leader. You may recall he challenged Maduro for the presidency in 2013. He was supposed to meet with Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, here in New York today, and he had his passport canceled at the airport last night. We understand from the UN that Mr. Capriles' attorney will be here instead, and Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein will meet with him this afternoon, and he has some sort of report that he's bringing to the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
So the attorney will meet in his place. The attorney will be there today, and he will meet in his place.
Yes.
So tell us, what can the UN do?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Carolyn?
What can the Security Council and the UN do in this situation?
Right. So the Council has only just had a briefing on it. They're not looking to act on the situation. Right now, it's an internal disturbance in the country. It's a regional issue. UNISOR, the Vatican, these are the mediators right now. But the UN is watching it closely. The Secretary General has been conducting telephone diplomacy with the mediators. He's watching it closely. The Council was really just briefed on the situation. The United States asked for that, but nobody is really acting right now. It's a wait and see situation. And the Latin American Council members, Uruguay and Bolivia, both said that they didn't think this issue belonged in the Security Council. The Security Council handles issues of international peace and security, and they say it's a regional issue, and the region is working on it.
So, Alvaro, if they then throw it back to the country to resolve their differences, do you see any of that happening on the ground? Can it happen? It seems like Maduro is one way, the protesters are the other way. Is there any negotiating going on there?
Carolina, I don't see any negotiation, at least in these days. Tomorrow, the opposition is going out of the streets again to protest to the center of the capital of Venezuela, Caracas. They cannot get in to the center. They want to march, protest. They want their rights, and they don't accept them in the downtown. They will continue protesting for elections, for respect of the parliament.
Alvaro, you grew up in Venezuela, correct? This probably isn't the Venezuela that you remember.
Oh, this is the worst moment in my life in Venezuela. I have a son. Here, it's difficult to find food. It's difficult to find medicines. Children are dying for medicine because they don't find it, and the government doesn't open the humanitarian channel to get the medicines and the aliments. People is dying in Venezuela. That's why it's important all the media, all the channels to let know what is going on in Venezuela, Caroline.
But in the meantime, Maduro blames this on his opponents. He says that the U.S. is backing his opponents.
Exactly. That's why yesterday President Trump expressed his concern about Venezuelan situation. Maybe he will give some sanctions to the judges here. That's very important. Everything is important. When I go out to the streets, I don't know, Caroline, if I come back to the office, because they don't want the media, they don't want people against the government. It's a very difficult situation. I don't know when this is going to finish.
Right. Well, we will keep everyone posted on that. Alvaro, stay safe. Margaret, continue to update us on the diplomatic front. We are out of time, but we'll be back again next week for another edition of The Correspondents. Stay up to date with all the latest world news at voanews.com and check out all of our shows right there. Just go to the Watch tab at the upper right. We're also on Facebook and YouTube at VOA The Correspondents. For all my colleagues who work so hard behind the scenes here at VOA, I'm Carolyn Persutti. So long from Washington.